At the wedding, my new husband slapped my son and said, "You're such a nuisance."
Hello everyone, enjoy these relaxing moments while you watch.
Maria sat next to the vanity table, the soft golden light of the lamp reflecting off the mirror. She gently brushed her long brown hair, her eyes sparkling with joy. Today was a special day, one she believed would mark the beginning of a new chapter in her life. Her elegant white wedding dress hung neatly on a rack, next to a vibrant bouquet of fresh hydrangeas. Matthew, her 8-year-old son, was playing with his favorite toy in the next room, his occasional bursts of laughter filling the air. "Matthew, are you ready yet?" Maria called out. "Yes, Mom. I'm putting on my bow tie," Matthew replied, his voice cheerful but slightly clumsy. Maria smiled. Her son always tried to please her, even if he was a little awkward. Today, she wanted Matthew to look perfect, so no one could criticize him. At that moment, James walked into the room. He was dressed impeccably in a black suit, looking like the epitome of a perfect man. With his tall stature and sleek black hair, James always exuded a certain charm. He looked at Maria with a tender gaze but then glanced at Matthew with a slight frown. "Matthew, why is your bow tie crooked?" "Come here, let me fix it," James said, his tone a bit stern. Matthew hesitantly walked over, trying to adjust his bow tie. But James quickly bent down and adjusted it with a firm hand, causing the boy to step back slightly. "You need to be more careful, Matthew. Today is an important day, don't embarrass your mother," James emphasized, his tone making the atmosphere in the room heavy. Maria frowned slightly but quickly convinced herself that James just wanted everything to be perfect. He was always a perfectionist, and she believed it was because he wanted the best for their family. "James, I think he's just a little nervous." "It's a special day," Maria said softly, trying to ease the tension. James nodded, but his expression remained uneasy. He adjusted his own bow tie in the mirror, then turned to Maria. "You should get ready. The guests are almost all here," he said. Maria watched him leave the room, a flicker of doubt crossing her mind. For a moment, memories of how James had treated Matthew in the past surfaced. There were times when he reprimanded Matthew too harshly or showed irritation when the boy didn't obey. But she reassured herself, maybe he just needs time to get used to being a father. The ceremony took place in a grand church, lavishly decorated with white and blue flowers lining the aisle and the tables. The guests, all close friends and family, were dressed elegantly, creating an atmosphere that was both extravagant and warm. Maria stood at the door, clutching her bouquet tightly. Matthew held her hand, his eyes shining with joy. "Mom, you look like a princess," Matthew exclaimed, his innocent voice making Maria laugh. "Thank you, Matthew. I'm so happy to have you," she replied, leaning down to kiss her son gently on the forehead. James stood at the front of the church, chatting with a few friends. When he saw Maria and Matthew approaching, he quickly walked over, but this time he couldn't hide his impatience as Matthew walked a little too slowly. "Matthew, hurry up," he said, his voice low but full of reproach. Maria tightened her grip on Matthew's hand, as if to shield him from James's stern gaze. The ceremony began, and everyone focused their attention on the couple. James looked at Maria with pride, but occasionally she caught his eyes flickering toward Matthew, as if the boy were a nuisance. When the priest asked, "Does anyone object to this union?" the room fell silent. But in Maria's heart, an unfamiliar feeling stirred. "It's nothing," she told herself. "Today is my day, and everything will be fine." Matthew sat in the front row, his legs swinging back and forth. Despite Maria's earlier instructions, he couldn't sit still for long. He gently bounced to the rhythm of the music, unintentionally deepening the furrow in James's brow. When the ceremony ended, the guests spilled outside, beginning to take photos and chat. Matthew ran to Maria, his face beaming. "Mom, can I have some cake now?" he asked, his innocent eyes looking up at her. Maria leaned down, smiling, about to reply when James interrupted. "Matthew, you need to wait. Why are you always so impatient?" James said, his voice filled with irritation. "He's just excited," Maria defended her son, but a vague sense of discomfort began to creep into her heart. James's words and tone were like small puzzle pieces in a picture Maria hadn't yet fully seen. But she convinced herself that James would eventually learn to love Matthew more. In that lavish wedding, amidst the laughter and glittering lights, an undercurrent of tension was slowly forming, unnoticed by Maria. The reception grew lively with soft music and the guests' laughter and chatter. Maria felt the pride of her family and friends as they showered her with compliments on her radiant appearance and the elegant event she had organized. But a subtle unease lingered in her heart, a feeling she couldn't quite explain. Matthew was standing by the dessert table, trying to reach for a small cake. His eyes lit up as he saw the strawberry frosting. "Matthew, don't eat too much, or you'll get a stomachache," Maria reminded him from afar, smiling gently. "I just want one, Mom." Matthew laughed, his face smudged with frosting. Just then, James walked over, placing a hand on Matthew's shoulder. "Matthew, you can't always do whatever you want. How many times have I told you to control yourself?" His voice wasn't loud, but it was sharp enough to make those nearby glance over. Matthew froze, his eyes reflecting confusion. He lowered his head and murmured an apology. "You don't have to be so strict," Maria interjected, trying to diffuse the tension. "Maria, you're always spoiling him. We need to teach Matthew how to behave, or he'll grow up to be a spoiled child," James said, his tone tinged with frustration. James's words hurt Maria. She took Matthew's hand and led him away from the crowd, avoiding the curious stares of the guests. They went to a quiet corner near the window. Matthew clung tightly to his mother's hand, his voice trembling. "Mom, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to make Dad angry," Matthew mumbled. "It's okay, Matthew. I'm here with you," Maria comforted him, though her eyes betrayed her sadness. Meanwhile, James was talking with his friends. One of his closest friends, Alejandro, noticed the tension in his expression and asked quietly, "James, what's wrong? You seem uneasy." "Matthew, that boy is always causing trouble. I don't understand why Maria keeps defending him," James said, taking a sip of his wine. Alejandro chuckled. "Come on, he's her son. If you want to be a good husband, you'll have to learn to accept that." James sighed, his eyes scanning the room before resting on Maria. A flicker of irritation mixed with weariness crossed his face. After a while, Maria returned with Matthew, who had calmed down. Her close friend Claire approached, taking Maria's hand. "Maria, are you okay? I sense some tension between you and James," Claire asked, her eyes filled with concern. "It's nothing, just a minor misunderstanding," Maria replied, forcing a smile. Claire looked deeply into her friend's eyes, as if she wanted to say more but hesitated. "If you need anything, you know you can come to me, right?" Maria nodded, but her heart felt heavy. She didn't want to bother anyone on this special day, even though the growing conflicts were becoming harder to ignore. The party continued with lively activities, but James's controlling behavior became increasingly apparent. He repeatedly demanded that Matthew sit still, not run around or make noise. Each time Matthew made a mistake, James frowned or sighed, causing the boy to shrink into himself. At one point, Matthew accidentally dropped a napkin on the floor while eating ice cream. Before Maria could say anything, James strode over, his eyes cold. "Matthew, can't you be more careful? This is unbelievable." James's tone was sharp, loud enough to make those nearby pause and look. "It's just a napkin, James," Maria said, her voice starting to lose its patience. "No, Maria. You need to take this seriously. If we don't teach Matthew discipline, he'll never learn proper behavior," James replied, his tone icy. Matthew lowered his head, his small hands clutching the napkin he had just picked up. Silently, he walked away, his eyes red. Maria felt her heart ache. She turned to James, but before she could say anything, he had already walked away to rejoin his friends. Claire, standing not far away, had been quietly observing. She approached Maria, speaking in a low voice. "Maria, I think James is being too harsh. The way he treats Matthew is unfair," Claire said bluntly. "Claire, I think he's just tired today." "James isn't a bad person," Maria replied, but her words sounded unconvincing even to herself. Claire was silent for a moment before gently placing a hand on Maria's shoulder. "I just want you to be happy, Maria. But please, think about Matthew too, okay?" Claire's words echoed in Maria's mind like a warning bell. Yet she still couldn't fully face the truth. Meanwhile, Matthew sat in a corner of the room, quietly playing with his small toy car. David, a family friend, noticed the boy and walked over. "Matthew, are you okay?" David asked warmly, his voice gentle. Matthew looked up, his eyes still wet with tears. "I don't want to make Mom sad, but Dad James is always angry with me." David smiled and sat down next to Matthew. "I think you're a very good boy. Don't worry, Matthew. Your mom loves you the most." David's kind words were like a small ray of light for Matthew, helping him feel a little better. From across the room, Maria saw the scene and felt a pang in her heart. She knew she had to do something, but she hadn't yet figured out how to confront James. Matthew left the dining area and slowly walked toward a small play area set up for the children. He no longer laughed or played, his eyes darting nervously as if afraid someone might notice him. Maria watched from afar, her heart heavy. She knew James didn't mean to hurt Matthew, but his behavior was becoming increasingly difficult to accept. Laughter echoed from another part of the room, where James was happily chatting with a group of guests. He stood there, confident and charismatic, but the cold looks he had given Matthew replayed in Maria's mind over and over. Claire came over to Maria, holding a glass of wine. "Maria, you need a break. Let me take care of Matthew for you," Claire said gently. "I'm fine, really," Maria replied, but her eyes never left Matthew. Claire sighed and shook her head. "You always try to act strong, but James. I don't know how else to say it. He's not the kind of man I thought you'd choose." Maria turned to her friend, trying to smile. "Claire, I believe in him. Maybe today is just too stressful." Claire wanted to say more but quietly stepped back. Maria knew her friend only wanted the best for her, but she couldn't admit that things weren't okay. At the play area, Matthew sat alone on a small bench, holding his toy car. He pushed it back and forth on the surface of the table, his eyes fixed on it as if trying to forget everything around him. David approached Matthew again, sitting beside him with a warm smile. "Matthew, do you want to play something else?" "I can join you," David offered, his voice kind. Matthew looked up at David, his tearful eyes glistening. "I don't want to play anymore. Dad James is mad at me because I'm not good." David was silent for a moment, then gently patted Matthew's shoulder. "Matthew, I know you're a very good boy. You don't need to worry so much. Sometimes grown-ups don't understand everything you feel, but that doesn't mean you're wrong." Matthew lowered his head, clutching his toy car tightly. David's words comforted him, but the sadness lingered. At that moment, James returned to the play area and saw Matthew and David talking. He frowned, walking over with a displeased expression. "Matthew, you shouldn't be sitting here being lazy. Go greet the guests, today is a special day," James said, his tone laced with irritation. David stood up, his gaze steady as he looked at James. "James, the boy is just resting. He's still a child." James turned to David, his eyes flashing with annoyance. "David, I think this is a family matter. Thank you for your concern, but Matthew needs to learn proper behavior." David seemed ready to argue further, but Matthew quickly stood up. "I'm sorry, Dad," the boy said softly, his voice full of fear. Maria walked over at that moment, having witnessed everything. She placed her hand on Matthew's shoulder, her gaze cold as it met James's. "James, was that really necessary? He's just a child, and today is our wedding day." "Everyone is supposed to feel happy," Maria said, her voice firmer than usual. James sighed and turned away. "I just want what's best for Matthew. But if you think I'm wrong, then do things your way." His words felt like a dagger to Maria's heart. She watched him walk away, the growing sense of frustration inside her becoming harder to bear. Claire pulled Maria aside, her eyes filled with concern. "Maria, you can't let this keep happening. Matthew needs you, and you need to protect him." "I know," Maria replied, her voice trembling. "But I don't know what to do. This is my wedding day, it's supposed to be the happiest day of my life." Claire squeezed her friend's hand tightly, speaking with conviction. "You're stronger than you think, Maria. Don't forget that." Meanwhile, Matthew stood quietly in a corner of the room, his eyes following his mother. He felt like a burden, as if his very presence was ruining everything. David approached Matthew, placing a comforting hand on the boy's shoulder. "Matthew, you didn't do anything wrong. I know your mom loves you more than anything." Matthew looked up at David, a small glimmer of hope in his eyes. "Really, Uncle David?" "Of course. And I believe your mom will always stand by your side, no matter what happens," David said with a warm smile. David's words were like a soothing balm for Matthew's young heart, but they weren't enough to erase the pain James had caused. From afar, Maria watched her son with David. She knew David was right, and that it was time for her to make an important decision. Matthew stood near the buffet table, holding a glass of orange juice Maria had just handed him. He sipped it slowly, his wide eyes taking in the lively atmosphere of the party. For a moment, Maria felt a sense of relief seeing her son at peace after the earlier tension. James stood in the center of the room, chatting with a group of important guests. His smile was flawless, his demeanor confident, like the ideal man. But Maria noticed that whenever Matthew accidentally drew attention to himself, James's expression flickered with impatience. David walked over to Maria, holding a glass of wine. "You seem tense, Maria. Did James say something to upset you?" "It's nothing, David. I'm just tired," Maria said with a forced smile. David glanced at Matthew, then back at Maria. "I think Matthew needs more protection than you realize. Don't let James push you around. This isn't okay." Maria didn't reply. David's words felt like a wake-up call, but she still didn't have the courage to face the truth. At that moment, Matthew accidentally dropped his glass of orange juice on the floor. The sound of breaking glass echoed through the room, drawing everyone's attention. The spilled juice splattered onto James's expensive suit. James froze for a moment, his face shifting from shock to anger. He strode quickly toward Matthew, his eyes cold as ice. "Matthew! What are you doing?" James shouted, his voice ringing out across the room. Matthew stepped back, his eyes filled with fear. I'm sorry, Dad." He stammered, his small hands trembling. Before Matthew could finish, James raised his hand and struck the boy hard across the face. The sound of the slap reverberated through the silent room. Matthew fell to the floor, tears streaming down his cheeks. He clutched his face, trembling as he looked up at James with pure terror. "James!" Maria screamed, rushing to her son. She knelt down, pulling Matthew into her arms and gently wiping away his tears. "What have you done?" Maria shouted, her voice filled with fury as she glared at James. "He needs discipline. He can't keep ruining everything and face no consequences." James retorted, his voice cold but tinged with unease as he noticed the judgmental stares from the guests. "Nothing justifies you hitting Matthew like that in front of everyone. Who do you think you are?" Maria yelled, her voice breaking with anger and heartbreak. The guests began murmuring, their shocked and disapproving gazes fixed on James. Some, like Claire and David, moved closer to see what was happening. "Maria, calm down," Claire said softly, placing a hand on her friend's shoulder. "Don't let this escalate further." "Escalate? Look, Claire. He hit my son. How can I stay calm?" Maria shouted, tears streaming down her face. David knelt beside Matthew, gently checking the boy's cheek. "Matthew, are you okay? Does it hurt a lot?" Matthew shook his head, but the tears kept falling. James stood there, trying to regain his composure. "Everyone, don't make a big deal out of this. I was just teaching my son how to behave," he said, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. "A good father never uses violence to teach a child." "You should be ashamed, James," David countered, his voice stern. The guests began to disperse, many shaking their heads in disapproval. Some chose to leave the party altogether, adding to the growing tension in the room. Claire took Maria's hand, helping her to her feet. "Maria, you need to get Matthew out of here, somewhere he feels safe. We'll figure this out later." Maria nodded, lifting Matthew into her arms as he continued to sob. Before leaving the room, she turned to look at James, her eyes filled with pain and anger. "You don't deserve to be my husband, and you certainly don't deserve to be Matthew's father," she said, her voice icy. James stood frozen, speechless. He simply stood there, as if all his authority had crumbled under the weight of the guests' condemning gazes. Maria left the party, carrying Matthew outside. David and Claire followed closely, as if to shield her and her son from anything worse. Outside, the cold evening air brought some clarity to Maria's thoughts, but the pain in her heart remained. She sat on a nearby bench, holding Matthew tightly in her arms. "I'm sorry, Mom," Matthew sobbed. "No, Matthew. You did nothing wrong. I'm sorry for letting you go through this," Maria whispered, her tears falling onto her son's hair. David sat beside them, his expression full of empathy. "Maria, you need to seriously think about your future with Matthew. I think things have gone too far." Maria remained silent. For the first time, she felt all the hope she had placed in James completely shatter. The atmosphere in the banquet hall seemed frozen after the incident. Soft music continued to play, but no one paid it any attention. Some guests quietly left, while the remaining ones gathered in small groups, whispering to each other and occasionally glancing toward James. He stood in the center of the room, looking like a man who had just lost control. Claire and David stayed outside with Maria and Matthew. Claire held Maria's hand, trying to help her calm down. "Maria, you can't let this continue. You need to confront James," Claire said, her tone firm. Maria looked down at her son, who was leaning against her shoulder, his eyes red from crying. She held Matthew tighter, as if trying to shield him from every terrible thing in the world. "I know what I need to do," Maria whispered, but her voice carried a determination she had never felt before. David sat beside them, placing a comforting hand on Matthew's shoulder. "Matthew, Uncle David is here. Everything will be okay. Don't be afraid." Matthew nodded slightly, but his eyes remained filled with worry. "Mom, please don't let Dad James get angry again. I don't want you to be sad." Hearing her son's words, Maria felt her heart shatter. She leaned down, kissed Matthew's forehead, and spoke softly but firmly, "Matthew, I won't let anyone hurt you again. I promise." After a few moments to gather herself, Maria stood up and handed Matthew over to Claire. "Claire, please take Matthew inside to rest for a while. I need to talk to James." Claire nodded, taking Matthew's hand, but she turned back to look at Maria, her eyes full of concern. "If you need anything, just call me." Maria nodded and then looked at David. "David, can you stay with Matthew for a bit? I don't want James anywhere near him." Don't worry. I'll stay right here, David reassured her, his tone steady and calming. Maria took a deep breath and walked back into the banquet hall. Curious eyes immediately turned toward her. Ignoring them, she walked straight toward where James was standing with a group of his friends. "James, we need to talk," Maria said coldly. James turned around, startled by the resolve in Maria's eyes. "What now? Are you going to make things worse?" "You're the one who made things worse, James. Let's talk outside, in private." Reluctantly, James nodded and followed Maria to a quiet hallway. "What do you think you're doing?" Maria demanded as soon as they were alone, her voice trembling with anger. "I'm teaching Matthew how to behave. He needs to understand that he can't always get his way," James replied, his tone full of misplaced confidence. "That's not how you teach a child, James. You had no right to hit Matthew, especially in front of everyone." Maria shouted, her eyes brimming with tears. "You always defend him. Have you ever thought that I'm trying to do what's best for this family?" James countered, but his voice began to waver. "This family? What family, James? You've never seen Matthew as your son. All you've done is make him afraid and hurt him. Is that the family you want?" James fell silent, his eyes avoiding Maria's as if he couldn't face the truth in her words. "I've been lying to myself for too long, thinking you would change, that you would learn to love Matthew. But I was wrong. You don't deserve to be a father, and you certainly don't deserve to be my husband," Maria said, her voice unwavering. "Maria, you're being emotional. Today was just a bad day. We can work through this if you give me another chance," James tried to reason, his tone softening. "No, James. This isn't the first time. I've seen who you really are. And this time, I won't let you hurt Matthew again," Maria replied, her words as firm as a hammer striking steel. James opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. He knew Maria was no longer backing down. Maria turned and walked away, leaving James standing alone in the hallway. She felt a newfound strength rising within her, a strength she had never known before. When Maria returned to where Matthew was, she saw him sitting on David's lap, listening to a story meant to comfort him. Claire sat nearby, her expression relieved when she saw Maria. "Are you okay?" Claire asked, her voice filled with concern. "I'm okay. And I know what I have to do," Maria replied, bending down to pick up Matthew. "Mom, are we going home?" Matthew asked, his eyes full of hope. "Yes, sweetheart. We're going home," Maria said, kissing her son's cheek, her gaze firm with determination. David stood up, looking at Maria with admiration. "If you need anything, I'm here for you." "I know, David." "Thank you so much," Maria replied, offering a small but resolute smile. Though the night had been filled with pain, Maria knew this was the beginning of an important decision she had to make for Matthew and for herself. Maria sat in a small room at the back of the hall, holding Matthew tightly in her arms. The boy rested his head on her chest, his eyes swollen from crying. Claire stood nearby, placing a hand on Maria's shoulder, trying to offer comfort. The tension from the incident with James still lingered over everyone like an unshakable shadow. "Maria, have you decided? You can't keep living like this," Claire said gently but firmly. Maria looked at her son, her eyes glistening with tears. "Claire, I know what I need to do. But I have to be stronger not just for me, but for Matthew." Matthew looked up, his small voice trembling. "Mom, I don't want to make you sad anymore. I promise I'll be good." Hearing her son's words, Maria felt her heart ache. She gently brushed Matthew's hair and kissed his forehead. "Matthew, you haven't done anything wrong. You're the most precious thing in my life, and I won't let anyone hurt you again." David stepped into the room, his eyes full of concern. "Maria, everyone knows what happened. Maybe you should go out and say something, or at least end the party." Maria lifted her head, her gaze filled with resolve. You're right. I can't let this continue. But first, I need to talk to my mother. Handing Matthew back to Claire, Maria walked toward her mother, Caroline, who was sitting in a corner with a worried expression. When Caroline saw Maria approaching, she stood up and took her daughter's hands. Maria, what happened? I've tried to stay calm, but the way James treated Matthew. I can't accept it, Caroline said, her voice trembling with emotion. Mom, I'm sorry for disappointing everyone. But today, I realized that James is not the man I need. More importantly, he doesn't deserve to be Matthew's father, Maria replied, her voice steady and resolute. Caroline squeezed Maria's hands, tears welling in her eyes. My dear, I've always believed you would do the right thing. Matthew needs you, and I'll always be here to support both of you. Maria smiled faintly, feeling a powerful sense of motivation from her mother's support. When Maria returned to the hall, James was standing in the center of the room, attempting to reassure the few remaining guests. He spoke with confidence, but Maria noticed the unease in his eyes every time her name was mentioned. Maria, are you here to say something? James asked when he saw her enter, his tone laced with a hint of challenge. Maria stared directly at him, stepping to the center of the room, where all eyes now focused on her. James, we need to talk. Right now, she said firmly. James forced a smile. All right, I'm ready. But I hope you're not planning to make a scene in front of everyone. Ignoring his comment, Maria let her gaze sweep over the crowd, finally settling on James's close group of friends, including Alejandro, his best friend. Thank you all for coming today. But I need to announce that this party will be ending earlier than planned, Maria said, her clear and commanding voice silencing the room. James immediately stepped closer to her, lowering his voice. Maria, what are you doing? Are you trying to humiliate me? Maria turned to face him, her eyes filled with both pain and resolve. Do you think this is about your pride, James? What about my dignity and my son's? You hurt Matthew in front of everyone. That's something I can't forgive. I've apologized. It was just a moment of losing control. James started, but Maria cut him off. No, James. This isn't the first time you've treated Matthew poorly. But I've looked the other way for too long. Today is the final straw. I can't continue living with someone who doesn't respect my son, Maria declared, her voice strong and unwavering. Alejandro stepped forward, trying to mediate. Maria, maybe you should reconsider. James truly loves you, he just has a bit of a temper. Maria shook her head firmly. Love never comes with violence. If he loved me, he wouldn't treat my son this way. James stood frozen, unable to respond. He looked around the room, seeing the judgmental gazes of Maria's family, friends, and the remaining guests. Turning back to James one last time, Maria's voice softened but remained resolute. James, I will protect Matthew at all costs. Even if it means ending everything between us. Before James could react, Maria turned and walked away, leaving him standing alone in the silent room. Outside, Maria held Matthew tightly and spoke to him in a gentle tone, Matthew, from now on, I promise I won't let anyone hurt you again. Matthew looked up at his mother, his eyes glimmering with trust. I love you, Mom. David, standing nearby, watched the mother and son with admiration and empathy. Maria, you did the right thing. I believe you and Matthew will be stronger after this. Maria nodded and smiled. For the first time that day, a sense of peace began to return to her heart. Maria sat by the window in her small room, watching the first rays of sunlight peek through. The previous night had been one of the longest of her life. James, with all the harm he had caused, was now just a fading shadow in her and Matthew's lives. Matthew was still asleep on the bed, his steady breathing giving Maria a sense of calm. The sudden ringing of the phone broke the silence. Maria quickly picked it up. Maria, it's Claire. Are you all right? Claire asked, her voice filled with concern. I'm fine, Claire. I'm just thinking about what to do next, Maria replied, trying to keep her voice steady. Don't worry. I spoke with a lawyer this morning. They said James has no legal rights over Matthew since he never officially adopted him. You just need to file for protection, and they'll handle the rest, Claire explained. Maria took a deep breath. Claire's words gave her newfound strength. It was time to take action. That afternoon, Maria went to the lawyer's office with Claire and David. The building was sleek and professional, with bold letters on the front that read, Rodriguez and Asociados. David gently placed a reassuring hand on Maria's shoulder as the three of them walked in. Maria, you don't have to do this alone. We're here for you, David said, his tone firm and supportive. A middle-aged woman in a neat suit stepped out of a meeting room. Hello, I'm Ana Rodriguez. I'll be representing you in this case. Please come in, and we'll discuss the details. Maria nodded and followed Ana into the room. Claire and David sat beside her, listening quietly. Ana began outlining the steps needed to protect Maria and Matthew's rights. You'll need to file a formal petition to prevent James from contacting Matthew. We'll also submit a request to address his acts of domestic violence. With what you've described, he won't be able to avoid legal consequences, Ana said confidently. Maria felt a weight on her chest. She knew this was the right path, but it wasn't easy to prepare for facing James again. What if he contests this? Maria asked nervously. We have evidence, particularly witness statements from the party. Claire and David can also testify on your behalf. He won't be able to avoid accountability, Ana reassured her. That evening, James unexpectedly showed up at Maria's door. He wore a black leather jacket, looking disheveled and tense. When Maria opened the door, his cold eyes met hers. Maria, I need to talk to you, James said, his voice rigid. There's nothing to talk about, James. You crossed the line. It's over, Maria replied, standing firmly in the doorway like an unyielding barrier. You think you can do this without my input? Matthew is my son too, Maria. James snapped. Your son. James, you've never treated Matthew like your son. To you, he's always been a burden. Stop lying to yourself, Maria retorted, her voice sharper than ever. James was silent for a moment before abruptly changing his tone. I just want things to be better. Let's start over, Maria. I can change. Maria scoffed. Change? It's too late for that, James. I won't let you hurt Matthew again. She slammed the door, leaving James outside, his anger boiling over. The next day, Ana filed the lawsuit in court. In the filing, she highlighted James's abusive behavior at the party, supported by statements from witnesses. James's lawyer quickly pushed back, accusing Maria of trying to tarnish his reputation. But Ana had prepared thoroughly, leaving no room for loopholes. In court, Maria's heart pounded as she faced James. He wore a black suit, his expression confident, but his eyes betrayed his anxiety. David and Claire sat behind Maria, silently offering their support. Ana stepped up to the stand, presenting the evidence clearly. Your Honor, Mr. James's behavior is unacceptable. We have a video from the party showing him committing an act of violence against Matthew, my client's son. In addition, we have witness statements from Ms. Claire and Mr. David. James stood up, attempting to justify his actions. I was only trying to teach my son proper behavior. Maria always blows things out of proportion. The judge banged the gavel, signaling James to be silent. Mr. James, any form of violence is unacceptable, especially against a child. Please restrain yourself from further comments. After deliberation, the judge announced, based on the evidence and witness testimonies, I am issuing a 6-month restraining order against Mr. James, prohibiting him from contacting Matthew. During this period, Mr. James must attend a behavioral control and domestic violence education program. Maria exhaled deeply, feeling as if a heavy burden had been lifted off her shoulders. But she knew this was only the beginning. She turned to David and Claire, offering a faint smile. "We did it." Maria left the courtroom with a sense of relief, though a lingering worry remained. Even though the court had barred James from contacting Matthew for 6 months, she knew it wouldn't guarantee he would let go so easily. David and Claire followed closely behind her, as they had throughout her most difficult moments. "Maria, you handled that so well," David said, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. His eyes were full of encouragement. "Thank you. But this isn't over. I need to be prepared for whatever James might do next," Maria replied, her gaze shifting to where Matthew was happily running around with Claire near the parking lot. Claire smiled and called out, "Matthew, do you want some ice cream? Let's get some before we head home." "Yes. I want strawberry." Matthew cheered, his face lighting up with excitement. David watched Matthew and then turned to Maria. "We need to make sure Matthew feels like life is back to normal as soon as possible. What happened shouldn't steal his childhood." Maria nodded, a soft smile forming on her lips. "You're right. I'll do whatever it takes to make sure Matthew always feels safe and happy." That evening, as Maria was preparing dinner in the kitchen, her phone buzzed unexpectedly. A strange number flashed on the screen. Maria hesitated for a moment before answering. "Hello," she said cautiously. "It's me, James," came James's cold and calculating voice. "What do you want?" "I've made everything clear in court." "Stop bothering me," Maria responded, her voice tinged with anger. "You think you've won? Don't be so smug. 6 months is nothing. I'll take back everything, including Matthew," James said, his tone dripping with menace. Maria gripped the phone tightly, trying to stay calm. "James, you have no rights to Matthew. If you continue to harass me, I'll call the police." James chuckled bitterly. "Go ahead and try. But remember, Maria, I'm not someone who's easily dismissed." Before Maria could respond, James hung up. She placed the phone on the counter, her mind racing with worry. Even though she had won in court, it was clear James wasn't ready to let go as she had hoped. The next day, Maria took Matthew to school. Along the way, he excitedly recounted the games he had played with Claire the previous day. Maria smiled, relieved to see her son slowly returning to his cheerful self. As they approached the school gates, a black car parked nearby caught Maria's attention. She looked closely and saw James sitting inside, his eyes fixed on them. Maria quickly ushered Matthew into the school and then turned back to face James. "What do you want, James? The court has already prohibited you from contacting Matthew," Maria said, her voice firm. James stepped out of the car, standing across from Maria. "I just wanted to see my son. There's nothing wrong with that. Stop justifying yourself. You're violating the court order," Maria replied, her eyes flashing with warning. James smirked. "Go ahead and call the police if you want. But remember, Maria, I don't give up easily." Maria said nothing more and turned to enter the school. She knew exactly what she needed to do next. That evening, Maria went to Anna's office, with David accompanying her to ensure her safety. Anna listened carefully as Maria recounted the encounter, taking detailed notes. "James has violated the restraining order. This is a serious matter. We will notify the police immediately. If he continues, we can request an extension of the restraining order or even press for jail time," Anna explained. "Thank you, Anna. I just want to protect Matthew. I can't let him hurt my son again," Maria said, her voice trembling. David took her hand and gave it a gentle squeeze to reassure her. "Everything will be okay, Maria. We won't let James harm you or Matthew." 2 days later, James was summoned by the police for violating the restraining order. He appeared calm at first, but as the questioning intensified, he began to lose control. "She's trying to take away my rights as a father. I just want to see my son. Is that so wrong?" James yelled at the officers. "Mr. James, your actions have violated a court order. If you continue, you will face more severe consequences," one of the officers stated firmly. James said nothing more, but his eyes burned with resentment. As he left the station, he vowed to himself that he wouldn't let things end this way. That evening, Maria received a call from Anna. "Maria, I just received an update. James has been given a strong warning by the police. If he persists, we can push for an arrest order. Rest assured, we're keeping a close watch on this case." Maria exhaled, feeling a small sense of relief. But deep down, she knew James wouldn't give up so easily. She could only hope the law would protect her and Matthew from any reckless actions he might take. That night, David visited Maria, bringing some food with him. "Maria, do you want to take a walk? I think you could use some fresh air." Maria glanced at Matthew, who was happily playing with his toys in the living room. "That sounds like a good idea. Matthew, do you want to go for a walk with Mommy and Uncle David?" "Yes. I want to go to the park," Matthew exclaimed excitedly. The three of them left the house, strolling through a nearby park. In the cool evening air, Maria felt her worries momentarily fade. But deep inside, she knew this peace was only temporary. The next morning, Maria woke up to the calm of her small home. Matthew was still sleeping soundly on the bed, clutching his favorite stuffed bear. She watched him, feeling warmth but also an unshakable worry about James. After his tense encounter with the police, Maria hoped he understood that it was over. But part of her knew that James's personality wouldn't let him give up so easily. As she was lost in thought, the doorbell rang. Maria opened the door to see Anna standing there, holding a stack of documents. "Good morning, Maria. I have some news to share," Anna said, her face serious. "Come in, Anna. What's going on?" Maria asked as she invited Anna into the living room. Anna placed the documents on the table and began explaining. "I've just received an update from the police. James has hired a new lawyer and is filing a petition to reconsider his access to Matthew. He's claiming that he's been treated unfairly and wants to prove his legal right as a father." Maria froze, feeling as though the ground beneath her feet had collapsed. Reconsider access. But the court already issued a restraining order. Why is he still being so persistent? "Yes, the restraining order is still in effect," Anna reassured her. "But his lawyer is trying to argue that Matthew needs a father figure in his life. However, we have enough evidence to counter this claim." Maria clenched her hands tightly. "I won't let him hurt Matthew again. I'm ready to face whatever comes next." A few days later, the reconsideration hearing took place. Maria entered the courtroom with David and Claire by her side. She could feel James's cold, calculating gaze from across the room. He sat next to his lawyer, exuding confidence. The judge began the hearing, asking James's lawyer to present his case. James's attorney, a middle-aged man with a professional demeanor, stood to speak. "Your Honor, my client, Mr. James, is a responsible father who wishes to be involved in his son Matthew's life. He acknowledges past mistakes but argues that these were due to temporary pressures. We believe that stripping him of access to his son is both unfair and detrimental to the child's development." Hearing this, Maria felt anger surge within her. James had never truly seen Matthew as his son, yet now he was playing the role of a perfect father just to regain control. Anna stood up to respond with conviction. "Your Honor, I must counter this claim. My client, Maria, has provided ample evidence of Mr. James's physical and emotional abuse toward Matthew. Additionally, we have witness statements, including from guests at the party, which clearly demonstrate that Mr. James is unfit to have contact with Matthew. The judge listened intently, taking meticulous notes. He then requested to view the video evidence Anna had submitted. When the video showing James slapping Matthew in front of the guests played, the courtroom fell silent. Some attendees shook their heads, their expressions filled with outrage. James stood up, attempting to defend himself. "That was just a momentary lapse of control. I never meant to hurt my son. I love him more than anything." The judge banged the gavel, signaling James to sit down. "Mr. James, your behavior is unacceptable. No matter how much you love your son, violence is never the answer." After reviewing all the evidence and hearing both sides, the judge delivered his ruling. "Based on the evidence and witness testimonies, I hereby uphold the restraining order against Mr. James in regard to Matthew. Additionally, Mr. James is required to attend a behavioral rehabilitation and psychological education program. Should he violate the order again, he will face more severe consequences, including possible imprisonment." James stood frozen, his face pale. He opened his mouth to speak, but the judge had already left the courtroom, concluding the hearing. After the trial, Maria felt an overwhelming sense of relief. She knew Matthew was finally safe. David walked up to her, offering a warm smile. "You did great, Maria. I believe things will get better from here," David said. "Thank you, David. I don't know where I'd be without everyone's support," Maria replied, her eyes filled with gratitude. Claire approached and hugged Maria tightly. "You're stronger than you think, Maria. And remember, you're never alone in this fight." The three of them left the courtroom, this time feeling a genuine sense of victory. Matthew was waiting at home with Caroline, and Maria knew she had made the right choice in protecting her son from James. That evening, Maria prepared dinner for Matthew. The boy sat at the table, happily recounting what he had learned at school. Each laugh from Matthew warmed Maria's heart. David arrived with a bouquet of flowers to celebrate Maria's victory. "These are to celebrate your win, Maria. And to thank you for never giving up," David said, his voice full of sincerity. Maria accepted the flowers with a smile. "Thank you, David. I think this isn't just my victory but a victory for everyone who loves Matthew." Later that night, after Matthew had gone to bed, Maria sat by the window, gazing at the bright moon outside. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but she also knew she had the strength to overcome any obstacle. With the support of David, Claire, and her loved ones, Maria was confident that she and Matthew would have a brighter future. Maria's story is a profound lesson in the power of love and courage to protect those who matter most. Despite facing control, violence, and James's manipulative actions, Maria never faltered. She stood up against injustice to safeguard her son. The story emphasizes that violence is never the solution and that those who are vulnerable need protection. It also highlights the invaluable role of friends and family in providing support during the most challenging times.
If you enjoyed this story, we invite you to give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Your support motivates us to keep bringing heartwarming stories almost every day. We are very grateful for your support. See you soon.